Do people know it's being recorded?
Thumbs up if people are joining, yeah. So I'm just going to get your meeting slide there. So I haven't actually started the webinar yet, so.
All right, okay. Sorry.
And for anyone speaking, the clicker is on the lectern there, so it's just a right to advance of that presentation.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to start now, and then when you see your name slide, that will be.
Okay. Okay.
So audio will be on from now. Do we need to leave a bit of time for people to get in? A few minutes just.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the launch of the Prosperity chapter of the Belfast City Health Profile. This is the third in the series. We already launched the People chapter a number of weeks ago and a summary in June of all of the 6 chapters. For those of you who haven't met, my name's Joan Devlin, and I'm delighted that we have a great lineup of speakers this afternoon. Apologies for the slight delay in beginning, but we had some technical hitches with connecting with our WHO speaker. So we have 3 speakers this afternoon. We have Monica Kowinski from WHO and headquarters in Geneva. We have Eric Eisen, who is the author of the publication, and we have Jackie Redpath, many of you will know, who is Chief Executive of the Shankill Partnership. The purpose of the profile is, as a WHO Healthy City, we are expected to deliver or produce a city health profile. But I think more importantly, the profile is very useful to organisations, public government departments and the voluntary and community sector in Belfast. It covers information in relation to health, wellbeing and inequalities on the 6P framework that you actually see behind me on peace, planet, place, people, participation and prosperity. So this afternoon's is very much on focusing on prosperity and well-being. For those of you who want to we encourage you to put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and the presentation from speakers will be recorded and uploaded onto the Healthy Cities website. And if you're using Twitter, you may wish to include the hashtag Healthy Belfast in tweets. But our first speaker this afternoon is I'm delighted to welcome Monica Kowinski. Some of you may know Monica. Monica worked with us in WHO Healthy Cities for a number of years and was a key organiser in the international conference that we held here in 2018. Normally, Monica will speak on the commercial determinants of health, and I think we're very familiar with the social, environmental and economic determinants of health, but I think commercial determinants of health is a relatively new phenomenon for those of us working in public health in Northern Ireland. But Monica is lead for she's the global technical lead for economic determinants of health, commercial determinants of health, private sector engagement, trade policy, sustainable development, corporate governance, public policy and capacity, transparency, accountability, power and trust, and lobbying. So it's very much around those broader commercial determinants of health as well as the governing issues. So over to Monica, and we're absolutely delighted you can join us this afternoon, Monica.
Thank you very much, Joan, and thank you very much to colleagues for the invitation to be able to join you today. It's a great pleasure to be in Belfast again, albeit virtually, and my sincere congratulations on the launch of the prosperity chapter, and also for all of the fantastic work that you're continuing to do in Belfast, and also inspiring all of us and leading this agenda as we try to implement our common objectives. So I'm just going to start my screen sharing now. I hope you can see it all there. So let me see. So I'm just going to run through, I have about 10 minutes with you today. So I'm going to run through three main areas that I wanted to introduce to you really. As Joan mentioned, this is a brand new area of work. It's for us as an organization. I left the Healthy Cities work in the European region to launch the global program 18 months ago. And the concept has really emerged out of the social determinant space. I wanted to introduce that a little bit to give you some of the background and the context, and then look at what this means in practice for all of us, and particularly all of you who are working on health and health inequities on a day-to-day basis. And finally, leave us with some of the prospective the areas that are emerging as what we can do. How do we work together, and how do we take this forward? So as a reminder, and Joan alluded to this, we're all very familiar with the concept that health does not start within the health services. In fact, by the time that we access health services, most of our health is already predetermined for us. So at least half of that is attributable to social determinants of health. And thanks to the work of Margaret Whitehead and Dahlgren and colleagues, we have an increasing understanding of the complexity of how these social aspects, social structures interact with one another and lead us to the manifestation of inequalities, inequities, and also our health outcomes. However, the role of the private sector in driving, in supporting and creating the enabling conditions for some of this has been relatively poorly understood within the social determinants framing. However, it's not something that's new at all. In fact, and I'm quoting Professor Nick Freudenberg here at the inaugural webinar on commercial determinants that we launched last year, that the commercial determinants can be considered some of the leading cause of global burden of disease and threats to planetary health. And in fact, most of the public health crises that we've seen in the last century have a significant commercial determinants dimensions to them. And of course, it's not new. We know, particularly with those of us working in the health behavior ends, we know that the private sector has had a significant impact on our health outcomes. The work that started in the tobacco side, in some cases up to 40 years ago, more recently work on alcohol, and our growing understanding of the dynamics and the challenges around the food area as well have really provided a significant basis for at least where some of our health harms are concerned. But the other side of that is that the private sector is a key partner. It is essential, you know that better than most at the local level. It is as a fundamental part of your communities, and the challenge for us really lies in how to lever the co-benefits of partnership with the private sector, how to lever the impacts, the positive impacts that the private sector can play, whilst protecting from harms and conflicts of interest. And so the work on the commercial determinants of health, which I lead in WHO and more broadly globally, reflects this dichotomy, the rise in commercial impacts on health harms, particularly in health equity harms, but also the essential role that the private sector plays in development, the development at the global level, but also urban development. We aim to, and we need to, build on existing public health approaches and, of course, evidence, and cover the spectrum of course for behavior, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then finally, that we need to ensure that we remember that this is rooted in the social determinants principles of power, equity, and governance. And what we're talking about here really is a distribution of power and resources, and how those distributions and those unequal access to, for example, information and also other key drivers of power lead to some of our inequalities here. So just a short word on definitions, so this is very important, and there has been a broad conceptual discussion over the last 10 years or so as commercial determinants emerged as a field of inquiry, and we have a definition that you can see here at the bottom. This is a WHO definition, although I can see that the reference isn't very visible, but I can share it I can increase that in the presentation afterwards, and it, as you can see, it's a very neutral definition where the commercial determinants are the conditions, actions, and emissions that affect health. And I've used a slightly condensed definition here in the top right, which we also use, where we're talking about the private sector in its broadest sense and the impact of that. So what does this look like in practice? And if we look here, for example, in the UK and Northern Ireland, out in the top 15 risk factors to our health as part of the Global Burden of Disease study in 2019, you can see that only 4 of them can be considered as not having a direct commercial component to it. So it's significant. And in order to understand that impact more, we need to understand that risk. And as WHO, we've developed a very simple conceptual framework, a draft framework that we're using, which considers this from 2 sides. And on the red side, you can see the corporate impacts on behaviors, on the physical and social environments. That's in the top right-hand quadrant on your screen. So really the determinants impacts, but then also the corporate impacts on regulatory systems and processes, which is very important to shape the structural determinants that creates the conditions for our policy and decision-making processes. But on the left-hand side in blue, you can see where we have the potential for interventions and change. And again, these are divided into 2 very simple areas: the corporate core business operations. So this is really around the products, the services that are developed, designed, and delivered, the sales of them, the supply chains, and the broader corporate impacts within that. So logistics, distribution, raw materials, and market prevalence. And in the bottom left-hand blue quadrant, we have corporate citizenship and personhood. And this reflects how the company as an institution interacts within society through CSR activities, public relations, political activities, lobbying, but also tax contributions and third-party activities such as business associations and even civil society. So this framework can be considered as a matrix. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but as you can see, if you run the quadrants against one another, you have different actors, you have different equity components within that, and you have different governance considerations that appear. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on our corporate citizenship and personhood dimension here, because this really takes us into the discussions around power, and which starts to identify and starts to show us how it is that the commercial determinants influence our health and health equity outcomes. And we can think of this in terms of 5 main vehicles of power: commercial impacts on political practices, on preference shaping through, for example, marketing and demand driving, commercial impacts on the knowledge environment, on the legal environment, and then also on the extra legal or illegal environment, which is actually relatively minor. So in understanding these drivers and impacts, we can start to see a number of priority areas emerging: that the broader environmental and social impacts of commercial practices and commercial actors, and how this impacts on our employment conditions, on our built and physical environments, but then also the economic environment and the supply chains aspects where we have identified growth markets. So for example, in using alcohol as a development strategy, which many of us have seen at urban levels, but also internationally. And then how the subsidies and corporate welfare and tax aspects manifest. And this really links to the question of who benefits, who gains, and who loses in terms of some of these interventions. On a broader scale, we have trade, development and investment strategies, international financial flows and markets, and then just very simply the marketing aspects, which have a significant impact on our social norms and our behaviors, as we all know. And there are some, on a global level particularly, there are a number of challenges that emerge for governments. So who to engage with and how, particularly when we think about third-party actors in civil society and the transparency considerations in there. Broader issues around misinformation, particularly in a knowledge environment and the use of science. And then normalization of commercial determinants in global architecture, which largely means that seeing health harming industries as a vehicle for human development, such as the alcohol industry or the tobacco industry. Oops, I'm going to go back one. So just a sort of very summary, so some of our top 4 challenges can be considered looking at these broader economic and financial environments and how commercial determinants shape the structural determinants that impact on our health and health equity outcomes, understanding where costs land and externalities, and making sure that we don't simply focus on the proximal effects, but look at this broader who gains, who benefits, and how that's distributed across our communities and our societies. Making sure that we take an equity lens on outcomes. We know that commercial practices are run on unequal channels and unequal and are least, those amongst us that can afford it the least are the ones that are affected the most. And then of course how to manage that conflict of interest and identify the risks and recognize where they appear. So what can we do? And fundamentally, what we're talking about here is taking a whole of society approach, which many of us are familiar with. We, of course, we know that health is a complex political choice and requires both whole of government and whole of society approaches. And our goal here in commercial determinants is to lever the power and the potential of the private sector as a partner for better health and health equity, while protecting public health from conflicts of interest and broader population health from harm. So there are 5 main drivers of actions that we can consider, and I'm just going to talk about the first one because I know I'm pushed for time, but I'll run through them quickly now. So the public sector obviously still maintains a key role in shaping the environment that commercial practice and commercial products participate in and how that influences on our health and health equity. But the second very important one is corporate governance and investment action, and particularly on a global level where we have different capacities and state capabilities in governing commercial determinants and seeing how we can engage the private sector itself through its boards, through the investor mechanisms that are there is an important intervention strategy for public health. The third is social demand for better corporate practices. And first and foremost, we need to know what corporate practices are ongoing and how they are steering public health decision or steering public health impact. And civil society and other community actors play a very key role here in holding not only others to account, but also demanding that change that we need to see in some of this area. Strengthening public interest knowledge, and this is very important when we can see what information is coming to policymakers, how that information is, who is behind that information, where the interests lie. And then finally, strengthening the prioritization of health in international instruments, and particularly trade instruments and international development agendas. So just very quickly on the public sector interventions before I move to close, we still have at the top of the list here the NCDs by best buys. The public sector has regulatory interventions, regulatory mechanisms, fiscal interventions that are still not fully implemented, and this is with no question will have a significant impact on how we see commercial determinants play out in communities across the different areas of the WHO global regions. Secondly, is to build capacity within the public sector to understand the commercial drivers of health and health inequities, to understand the conflicts of interest and potential differing perspectives that we have within policy tensions within that. And that leads me to the health and all policies approach, which already looks at the implementation of complex policy challenges across different arms of government, whether that's national or local government. And this is that we have the potential to adapt and extend that to include the commercial sphere outside of government as part of that approach. Conflict of interest policies and the transparency and accountability mechanisms within that, and supporting the independence of civil society in the public sphere. We know that funding is not always available, particularly for public health NGOs, but civil society is a key aspect of ensuring that we can take action on the commercial determinants of health. And then finally, within that, of course, the role of local government as the implementing arm of our public policies, and how commercial determinants, how the tensions arise at that local level, but also where we have that potential for community action and the engagement of local economic operators in health, in health goals, in health equity approaches across urban areas. And three sort of policy points to remember within that, as we're seeing across the different parts of the globe, that countries are starting to think about post-COVID recovery, and what does that mean, and how much are we still focusing on the commercial practices, or we're still seeing the commercial practices that are harmful to health, whether that's directly or indirectly through environmental harms and others, how much we see them as vehicles for recovery and growth, and what that will mean for the perpetuation of some of the global challenges that we're seeing today. That's understanding or considering commercial determinants as a public finance issue. So taxation, not only in talking about taxation of products, but also in terms of corporate taxation and how that contributes to public financing. And then maintaining, and this is my congratulations to you here in Belfast, maintaining the perspective of the role of health equity in economic development and local development here, and how they're intrinsically linked. So just my final slide, my final comment, this is still very new. So, as I said, the Global Programme of Work was initiated only 18 months ago. We have just completed the scoping phase of the work programme and moving into taking forward some of our deliverables and key priorities for the next few years. The first of which is the Global Report on Commercial Determinants, which we have just initiated only this week, in fact, and we will be reaching out to stakeholders over the next 6 months and asking for your input and your participation into helping shape the global report and the scope of that report in order to inform the global recommendations on actions in this area. It's the first ever global report on commercial determinants, so this is a very exciting and privilege for me to be able to lead and be part of. And we also it's not here yet, as you are hearing this hot off the press, but we will hold a global conference on commercial determinants where we will call for abstracts and examples of good practice of how this has been addressed at different levels, including at the local level. And we very much hope to have you involved and participating within that. So just thank you very much from my side, and once again, thank you, Joan, and to the organisers for the invitation to be here. And I'm delighted to be able to join you and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Monica. I think that has been really helpful in increasing our understanding on the role of, particularly on the role of the public sector and that relationship with the private sector in addressing the commercial determinants of health and also well-being and inequalities. And I think here in Belfast there is particularly a strong public sector. We have a high number of people employed in public sector and government departments. So thank you so much, and delighted you can stay with us. Our next speaker is Erica Eisen. Erica is probably no stranger to you. She's presented at the last two launches of our profile with us. She's worked in the health sector for the last 30 years, working across the spectrum from acute care to public health. She now specialises in public health but looks at the public health aspect of healthcare as well as protection and promotion of health. Her particular specialities are health impact assessment, health and all policies, and she has worked as an expert advisor to Healthy Cities from 2003. So a warm welcome to Erica and her presentation on the detail of the Prosperity chapter.
Thank you, Joan. And just to preface this presentation, before we go into it, to say that Monica has outlined the commercial determinants of health, but of course, as this is a new concept, we have yet to construct the data in a way that I could follow Monica's presentation with information directly on the commercial determinants of health. So, it's a bit more traditional. The presentation falls into two parts. First of all, we're going to look at some of the economic data for the city. And then secondly, we're going to look at some of the education data for the city, which I hope will be a good segue into the presentation that Jackie will give to us on work that's been happening in East Belfast. The other thing I'd like to say is when we were working on the profile, we decided to use as a cutoff point either the calendar year 2019 or the financial year 2019-20, i.e. before COVID. And we did this very specifically to give us actually a snapshot or a baseline for the city before COVID happens. As some of you who've already been on previous presentations will know, we will be doing a kind of quick look at how COVID might have affected some of the indicators. Some indicators have been affected by COVID, it's coming through in the data now, but others are yet to show a large enough effect. But this data, I feel, gives us a snapshot of the city around 2019-20 and can be used as a baseline for going forward. How are we recovering from COVID? And also the way in which we may want to develop the health, well-being and prosperity of the city. So that said, I'll start the presentation. We're focusing on prosperity, but as I said, that has two sides: economic activity in the city and then also looking at some of the education indicators. So just a few broad brush headlines for you. Compared with Northern Ireland, Belfast has a higher percentage share of jobs in the public sector, as just indicated by Joan, but private sector jobs are increasing. There's a trend since 2009 of that. And Belfast also has a higher percentage share than Northern Ireland of full-time jobs when compared with part-time jobs. The main industries, again, as Joan has highlighted, are public administration, education and health. And I'll show you some more detailed diagrams in a moment so that you can see this quite visibly. Banking and finance, and distribution, hotels and restaurants, which is probably not surprising as Belfast is becoming a very popular tourist destination. The main occupations in Belfast are professional. These are all standard occupational categories that are used in developed countries. So the main occupations are professional, associate professional and technical, administrative and secretarial, sales and customer services, and then what's known as elementary services, which may be things such as waste management services, cleaning services, etc., fall under elementary services. But these are not spread across the 4 assembly areas, for instance, in Belfast, and we'll see some diagrams to show us that. In terms of economic activity, again, compared with Northern Ireland, Belfast has a lower economic activity rate, and the corollary of that is a higher economic inactivity rate, and we'll look at some of the reasons for that in a minute. It also has a lower employment rate. There's a higher average claimant count overall, but that is decreasing. There's a higher level of underemployment, and there are 2 indicators in the profile to show underemployment. There's the underemployment indicator where you're asking people who are part-time employed whether they want either another part-time job or they want to be full-time employed, or there's an indicator looking at people who would just like more work. So There's also a lower percentage of the working age population with a degree level or below degree level qualification. Again, we'll look at that in more detail. And there's a higher percentage of the working age population with no qualification whatsoever when compared with Belfast. I won't go into the comparisons with other local government districts, but that's in the full chapter. And obviously, we're all restricted for time today. So in terms of poverty, it's worth noting that in Belfast, 1/5 of household income on average is from benefits and tax credits. The proportion of weekly income from wages is actually decreasing. Compared with Northern Ireland, Belfast has a lower gross disposable household income per head and lower gross weekly pay, and that's using the full-time median wage to judge that. And I've just put up the data for by place of residence. I haven't complicated it with by place of work, which then involves looking at people who are commuting into Belfast to do work and their wages. And there's higher relative income poverty before housing costs, not only for all individuals, but also for children. And there's also higher food insecurity, food poverty in Belfast compared with Northern Ireland. Another thing we've looked at is fuel poverty, and going up to 2019-20, i.e. pre-pandemic and also pre-energy crisis, Belfast's level of fuel poverty were lower than Northern Ireland's, which was a good thing, but actually with the current energy crisis, this may well be one of the indicators that changes dramatically. In terms of deprivation, Belfast has the highest percentage of Northern Ireland's 100 most deprived super output areas. Super output areas can vary in Northern Ireland from anywhere for 1,000 people, and one of the largest is around 4,000 people. But, you know, there's on average 2,000 people to a super output area. Belfast has the highest percentage of super output areas in Northern Ireland's 10% most deprived areas, and Belfast has the second highest percentage of super output areas in Northern Ireland's 20% most deprived areas, and Belfast West is the most deprived parliamentary constituency in Northern Ireland. Oops, I haven't gone over. So this is where I wanted to show you some more detailed data. Here at the moment, we're going to be looking at assembly area data for education, which is exciting. We've also got lower level, finer grain data looking at district electoral areas. But for the economic data, we have got assembly area data. And this is just to show you how deprivation is working across the assembly areas, and we have as a comparator Belfast local government district and Northern Ireland. So if we look at the percentage of super output areas from each of Northern Ireland's deprivation quintiles, so quintile 1 is the most deprived, quintile 5 is the least deprived. And it's very interesting once you start doing these diagrams. Even though you write these things down and you see the word, it's not until you see the pictures that go with them that things become very stark. So if we were to look at Belfast East, you can see that they have a much smaller percentage of SOAs from each of from the most deprived quintile, the kind of blue colour at the left-hand side of each of the columns kind of sections. And it's almost a mirror image of Belfast North. And then if we look again at Belfast South, it's almost a mirror image of Belfast West. So in Belfast South, we have the highest percentage of super output areas that are in the least deprived quintile. The other way you could say that is they're the most affluent areas. Whereas in Belfast West, there's almost the same number of super output areas that are in the most deprived quintile. So you can see from this diagram that South is the most affluent, Belfast North and West are the least affluent, and then Belfast East is somewhere not quite in between. There's still Belfast East can do badly in some particular areas. So it's best not to make sweeping generalizations, because some of the fine-grained data we'll look at afterwards is going to show us things about Belfast East as well. But in terms of poorer outcomes relating to economic activity, worse for people in Belfast West and Belfast North overall, people who are actually living in the most deprived areas of Belfast, which are concentrated to a certain extent in West and North, but there are pockets of deprivation in both East and in South. And also there is a particular problem of children who are in relative poverty before housing costs. So this slide looks at deprivation according to the 7 domains of deprivation. So although this has got all of the domains in, all 7 domains, what we're particularly interested in is the kind of bright blue bars on the left-hand side of each set of bars, followed by the kind of rust-coloured one. So the blue bars show us income, and the rust-coloured bars show us the level of employment. And again, here we see that Belfast West has the highest percentage of super output areas. In Northern Ireland's most deprived 20% of the employment domain. So that means Belfast West is the most deprived in terms of the employment domain, whereas Belfast North is the most deprived in terms of the income domain. They're doing not as well as Belfast South and Belfast East in terms of deprivation in terms of employment, but they're doing a lot better, say, than Belfast West. So you can see that South and East do relatively well in terms of not being as deprived in terms of employment and income, but again, West and North are doing quite poorly. So this is the percentage of super output areas in these assembly areas that are in the most deprived 20% for each of those domains. So this is one of the tables, and I just put it up not to talk you through it because actually I've got a diagram, but this is just to highlight the summary document, how we've tried to condense this information for you across the assembly areas. And this one shows the main types of occupation of the working population in each assembly area. And that's my next slide. And so if we're trying to understand why, for instance, deprivation may be more intensely concentrated in Belfast West and Belfast North, if we were to look at Belfast South, that very large rust-coloured column there, that shows the percentage of people, so that reaches just over 40%. 40% of the working age population in Belfast South are in professional occupations, therefore they're more likely to have higher incomes and they're less likely to be deprived, which matches up with the deprivation data I've shown you. Belfast East does better than Belfast West and Belfast North, but it's not doing anywhere near as well as Belfast South. So you can look across the various trades that are shown here. We've got managers, directors, senior officials, administrative and secretarial, sales and customer service, professional, skilled trade, process plant and machine operatives, and associate professional and technical, caring, leisure and other services, and elementary. And I think what stands out to me as well about this slide, apart from the fact that South has a very high percentage of professional people, which is going to account for their level of income and their low level of deprivation. If you look at Belfast North and Belfast West, a lot of those columns are in a similar sort of numerical or percentage-wise area. They've got a spread across those occupations, as opposed to a lot of those occupations dominating. So there's quite an interesting thing, I think, for people working at a lower level to study these figures and see what that means for the work that you do in your own area. I said I'd show you this slide, and I think this is also very interesting, especially for people who are working in public health or health and well-being. This shows the reasons for economic inactivity across the assembly areas. And again, if we look at North and West, I think it's quite shocking that in Belfast North, almost 14% of people, it's due to long-term sickness, stroke disability. That's the grey bar. And then in Belfast West, it's over 16% of people who are economically inactive. It's actually due to long-term sickness and disability. The other reason that is quite dominant in this slide as well is being economically inactive because of caring for family or caring for the home. And here we can see, as I said, it's best always to look at this fine-grained data, that here Belfast East has quite a similar number of people who are caring for family and home as reasons for economic activity. And it's also interesting that the only place that has a large percentage of people where being a student is the reason for economic activity is actually in Belfast South, which of course, when we launch the Place chapter, you'll see obviously, and you all know, living in Belfast, but it's the highest concentration of HMOs in houses of multiple occupation in Belfast. So again, the data really is beginning to tie up as we bring out more and more chapters. What I've done in this slide, this is again Belfast. This is the employment rate of the working age population by quintile of deprivation. So remember that quintile 1 are people who are living in the most deprived areas, and quintile 5 are the people living in the least deprived areas. And it's very noticeable if we just look at quintile 1 and quintile 5, how there's less, this shows you a bit of a time trend as well. We've got 2014 and 2019 data on here, but what you can see is that the employment rate is much higher in the least deprived quintile or the more affluent quintile compared with the most deprived quintile. But another reason, again, to look at the fine-grained data is if we now look at quintile 2, which are the second most deprived areas, you can see that actually quintile 2 between 2014 and 2019, their employment rate has actually declined, so that it's coming closer to the employment rate in quintile 1 in 2019. So although there's a general increase in employment rate across all the quintiles, that's not happening in quintile 2. So if we're targeting need or targeting our efforts where they are most needed, you can't just focus on the most deprived, you also need to look at what's happening in other quintiles to see if actually they need support as well. So I like this slide in terms of we need fine-grained data and we need to be able to target where we do our interventions for best effect. So this is just a slide to try and encapsulate some of the economic activity data. Belfast East and Belfast South in general do better. Belfast South tends to do the best. So this is just to show that there's that split going on. And Belfast North and Belfast West, sometimes one is lower than the other, sometimes one is higher than the other. But in general, North and West have lower economic activity rates, higher economic inactivity rates, lower employment rates, higher average claimant count rates. We've also looked at the claimant count rates for young people, again, trying to be more fine-grained about things, and also for long-term unemployed. And so what I'd like to point out there, especially as Jackie's going to come on, Belfast East, if you look at the annual average claimant count rate, in general, that's lower in Belfast East, but then if you look at young people and long-term unemployed, I beg your pardon, then it's one of the higher ones. So again, another argument for looking at fine-grained data. So this is to segue into the next section, which is going to be looking at education. And this slide shows us the percentage of the working age population by qualification level across Belfast Assembly areas. And again, we can see that actually Belfast South, the blue bars we're looking at now, that shows the percentage of the working age population with a degree level and above, and that's highest in Belfast South, it's over 50%. East, it's just over 40%, but again, if we look at Belfast North and Belfast West, they're very low in terms of degree level and above. If we look at below degree level, then you can see that actually below degree level, Belfast North and Belfast West are doing quite well in terms of that level of qualifications. But if we look at no qualifications, then again, Belfast North and West are doing quite badly. So if we're looking at education now and we're trying to assess need, it's quite complex assessing need and there's not much information in the data. Pupils with special educational needs, stages 1 to 4, and pupils with special educational needs, stage 5. Belfast has got higher percentages of those when compared with Northern Ireland. Similarly, primary school pupils who've got free school meal entitlement. And I think this reflects the level of deprivation that there is in Belfast. And there's also a higher number of pupil suspensions in Belfast compared with Northern Ireland. Looking over at achievements, then in terms of GCSE grades A star to C, which include English and maths, there's another indicator that doesn't specify including English and maths, then Belfast has lower percentages of school leavers achieving this level of qualification. It's called level 2 qualifications. If we look at free school meal entitlement school leavers, they've got lower percentages achieving the level 2 qualifications. And there are also less school leavers entering higher and further education in Belfast than there are in Northern Ireland. If we look at the primary pupils with free school meal entitlement in Belfast, again, we beginning to see this typical pattern where Belfast North and Belfast West have the highest percentages of children who have got free school meal entitlement at primary school. We haven't used the secondary school data because that can be underreported due to the greater level of stigma that the older pupils may feel in claiming their free school meals. So we concentrated on primary schools. If we go down, I promised you this, to look at district electoral area, which is DEA, then of the 10 DEAs in Belfast, you can see quite a marked difference of primary school, the percentage of primary school pupils with free school meal entitlement across the city. So here on this slide, we can see that Blackmountain, Court, Old Park and Titanic have all got very high percentages of primary school pupils with free school meal entitlement. And we can use this as a proxy for coming from maybe a deprived area, and they may have higher needs in terms of the resources to support them. If we now look as well at another proxy for an indicator of need, this figure shows us primary pupils with special educational needs, stages 1 to 4, that's the blue bar on the diagram, and special educational needs, stage 5, that's the rust-coloured bar on the diagram. And again, we can see more clearly with SEN stages 1 to 4, again, Blackmountain, to a certain extent Court, Old Park, also Titanic, have got high levels of pupil with special educational needs 1 to 4. And if you look carefully at the diagram, although it's a bit difficult to distinguish, then Court as well has a high percentage, Old Park. But interestingly, there's not as much variation in SEN stage 5 as there is in SEN stages 1 to 4. But this is need that has to be met. Those children need support, and we have to find ways of giving that to them. So to summarise that, we've got poorer outcomes for pupils and school leavers in West and North. And in terms of the DEAs, if we look at the indicators where we're looking at pupils with SEN stage 5 achievements for level 2 qualifications, then there are 3 DEAs that always come up in the data, and those are Court, Old Park and Titanic, and sometimes Black Mountain. Again, this is another table that we've given you in the summary report, which tries to put all this information together. So you've got one quick look at it to get an idea. This one is to show levels of inequality with the potential for inequity. This slide shows you the difference between the percentages of non-free school meal entitled children and free school meal entitled children in terms of achieving level 2 qualifications. So as you can see, Belfast South has the largest gap between the non-free school meal entitled children and the free school meal entitled children in terms of the achievement, which I think is quite interesting, because if you look across this figure, you can see that the achievement of children who are entitled to free school meals is pretty much similar across those 4 assembly areas, despite whatever level of deprivation is happening in those areas. And yet the achievement of the non-free school meal children has got the most variation in it. And I think, I mean, I don't know why that is, but I think this kind of thing needs to be investigated when we're thinking about how we target various needs and interventions in order to help children achieve better, and therefore, you know, affect their life course, the amount of money they'll earn, the jobs they can go into, all the stuff we've seen earlier on in the economic activity data. So this is the same data, but this is showing it at DEA level. So again, we can see that Ormiston, actually, that's got quite a large gap in between its non-free school meal entitled children and its free school meal entitled children. But you can begin to see the variation, again, as I pointed out, for non-free school meal entitled children, whereas it's a fairly similar level still across the free school meal entitled children across all of those DEAs. So I think there's something going on there that needs to be looked at when we're considering the way we educate and support children in schools. So this is my last couple of slides, you'll be pleased to know. This is the percentage of school leavers by destination in Belfast LGD. So almost 50% of school leavers go on to higher education, but there's also 20% go on to further education, but actually 13% go into employment, 11% go into training, but 7% become unemployed or their destination is unknown. That's the average across Belfast. Sorry, I'm clicking the button. It doesn't seem to be doing anything. Oh, there we are. Here we have it across the different assembly areas. And you can see that actually a higher percentage, whereas we had 47% across Belfast, if we look at Belfast South again, we can see that over 60% of school leavers in Belfast South go on to higher education, whereas it's just over 40% for both Belfast North and West, and almost 50% in Belfast East. So you can see the differences when you go down to the finer grain data of where there is need and where we need to consider different types of intervention for different levels of need. This clicker doesn't like me anymore. And here, sorry, this is showing the same data again at DEA level. For those of you who are working locally, you can see which district electoral areas are doing very well in terms of higher education and which are not doing so well. So again, it's our old friends. If we were to look at higher education, Court, Old Park and Titanic haven't got as higher percentages of children, school leavers, going on to higher education. Now, some of them do have higher percentages going into further education, and some of the school leavers may want to be in employment. But I think if we look even at the low levels we've got, If you look at unemployed unknown, then again, we have Court, Titanic, who have got quite high levels of children being unemployed or their destination is unknown, and Black Mountain as well doesn't do so well on that. So again, I think looking at that fine-grained data is very helpful when you're doing your work at a local level. So this is just to summarize the school leavers destinations. These are the 4 DEAs that I think have got higher levels of need in terms of supporting children to maybe have a better quality education, have a better opportunity of achieving qualifications that will then help them go into better quality employment and be able to earn more, which will affect their health and well-being. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erica, for an excellent and detailed presentation on the prosperity chapter. And we can see some of the successes in Belfast, but also many of the challenges, particularly in relation to inequalities in health. And our next speaker actually has been key to addressing some of those challenges in the Shankill area, particularly in the area of education. So a warm welcome to Jackie Redpath. Many of you will have known Jackie for many years. Jackie's worked as a community worker in the Shankill area. He served as the chief executive of the Shankill Partnership from '96. And he's been at the forefront of many initiatives in the Shankill itself. He was involved in the 90s, he was involved in Northern Ireland's unfolding peace process, both locally and internationally, particularly involved in the United States and the EU. And Jackie was awarded the American Ireland Fund Leadership Award in '95, an MBE for services to community in '97, and an honorary doctorate from Queen's in 2016. So a warm welcome, Jackie, and thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for that. Quite an introduction. Delighted to be here and to have the privilege of presenting here. I'm aware that we started late, and I'll try and curtail what I'm going to say and squeeze it into a shorter period of time. But I just wanted to say, in terms of this topic of prosperity, it strikes me that the Belfast Agenda, which is produced by the Belfast Community Planning Partnership and at present is being refreshed, has pointed out that Belfast is one of the youngest cities in Europe, with 1/3 of its population under the age of 21 and 1/5 under the age of 15. And that 1/5 is a growing percentage. So if we look forward, as the Belfast Agenda does, to 2035, the prosperity of the city really does depend on us making sure that the large proportion of this city who are young people, it depends on them, and we have to do right by them. And that's really what the Greater Shankill Children and Young People Zone is attempting to do. The zone is quite simply a framework within which we are seeking to transform the lives of one entire generation of children and young people in the Greater Shankill area. And that equates to 5,968 young people who are between the age of, from birth to the age of 20, is the population of that age group in the Greater Shankill. And that is the generation that we are seeking to transform their lives through the Greater Shankill Children and Young People Zone. Picking up on what Erica was saying, the notion of the zone, of a place-based approach, is predicated on the notion that if you have a fierce concentration of a problem, then what you need to do is have a fierce concentration on addressing that problem in a concentrated and coordinated effort. And that is what the Greater Shankill Zone, by creating a framework for action, is attempting to do, but it's also creating a framework for strategy, because these issues have been a long time in the creation and will take a generation to resolve. There are no quick fixes in dealing with a deficit that children and young people have in various areas of the city. And hence the zone is a place-based approach. That place is the Greater Shankill in Court Ward, as Eric has mentioned, and straddling actually North and West Belfast. The zone and the Greater Shankill is at the heart of some of the highest levels of educational underachievement and also of health inequalities. And those two things, educational underachievement and health inequalities, are inextricably linked. We have looked closely at the cause of the causes of the levels of educational inequality in the Greater Shankill area. And many other people have blamed various things and have been involved in a blame game about parents, about schools, about the community, about paramilitaries, even sometimes blaming the children themselves. But in fact, this is to do with a structural issue, in that I was the last generation born in the Shankill, which I was, who didn't need a single qualification to their name, not a single exam, to make my way in life, because I was destined to work from a generation to work in the shipyard, in the heavy industries of Belfast, and engineering and Mackey's, in the linen industries. And for those industries, you didn't need a single qualification to get in. You were spoken for. You went in there because your father worked there, or you had an uncle or whatever that worked in there. There was a family involvement, but you didn't need a qualification. And therefore, for generations, until the 1970s, when those old industries collapsed, we didn't have any tradition of valuing education. That was no one's fault. It was simply that we didn't need it. The old saying was that your education started with your apprenticeship. So when looking at that, we realized that this is not a blame game. This is a result of a structural situation that has been across so many generations over decade upon decades. And therefore, it's a reason why it is difficult to address this issue. Government have attempted to address it. We in the community have attempted to address it over decades. I have counted over 25 initiatives over 25 years, large, small, good, bad, and different, that have attempted to do something about educational underachievement. And yet, while some have been successful to a degree, none of them have transformed the situation. And the reason for that has been that they have focused, I believe, too narrowly. Because when we looked at a community that doesn't value education for traditional reasons, then attempting to create the value on education is almost like a missionary venture. And in fact, what we discovered through all the work that we had done in Sure Start and integrated services for children and young people, we discovered that we had never, ever come across a family, come across a parent, particularly a mother with a young child, particularly a mother with a newborn child. We had never come across one who did not value their children, their child. May not have valued education in the formal sense, but they valued their children. And that was like a light bulb moment for us in the development of the zone. Because what we said was, if people want something better for their child, which is what they wanted, how do we find out what that something better is? Because that something better is the outcome, the change that they want for their child, not the government's outcome, not our outcome, but their outcome. How do we find out what that something better is? And it was very simple. We talked to them. And so we have developed a method of talking to parents with very young children, but critically to children and the young people, to gather the voice of children and young people about that something better that they want, about the story they want their life to be. And we have engaged in this conversation process, assisted by Queen's University, who are analysing the conversations directly with children and young people about the story they want their life to be. And we have constructed a means of doing that. And in developing the story that they want their life to be and hearing that story, we then talk to them about the pathway to get there. And then on starting that journey, that pathway, we begin in the zone to put sustained support around each child as they take that journey. And that's on the basis that no child, none of us in fact, have done this alone. And that's that sustained support is required. One child at a time for as long as it takes. That child-centred approach has been critical and is critical to the zone and to how we are moving forward. But not only that, it is critical that in that journey and that supported journey for every child in the Greater Shankill, that journey is a seamless journey. It begins not just with birth, it begins before birth and continues through early years, through the children's years, through teenage years, into young adulthood. And that is critical. In that sense, this is not just about education. This is about every context in which a child lives their lives. And it brings me to my last point quite quickly. And that is that this sustained support for this generation of children in the Greater Shankill and in other places in Belfast that Erica talked about, where you have this fierce concentration of the educational and health deficits indeed. It needs a partnership approach. It is what a recently produced report, a First Start, for children and young people addressing educational underachievement, calls a whole community approach to education. It's what Hillary Clinton called in her book, "It takes a village to raise a child." And so it is that partnership approach is absolutely critical, because children live their lives in many different contexts. One of the failures of initiatives in the past is that they thought the issue could be resolved through school-based approaches. School-based approaches are absolutely critical, but on their own, they will not trump the deficit that exists across all the contexts in which children live their lives. So we need to bring those contexts together in a partnership. One of the early statistics that emerged from a First Start report was that a child between the age of 4 and 18 spends only 13% of their waking hours on average in school. 87% of a child's waking hours between the age of 4 and 18 spent in other contexts. Critically, of course, in a family context when they're very young, almost exclusively in their early years, and then in a whole community context as they become teenagers and young adults as well. So we have to get all those contexts together to provide a sustained and sustainable pathway for children and young people in their journey forward. The Greater Shankill Children and Young People Zone is attempting to do that in a place-based approach. It's not a model that can just be lifted and put in somewhere else, because it's been the result of a long process of development, and it will always be under development. But there's a rationale that applies to all these places that have this educational deficit, and the rationale for a place-based approach, in that it recognises that no one group can resolve these problems on their own. It brings a fierce focus to the areas where the problems are most concentrated. It maximises local assets through collective impact. It creates synergy across services. It supports children in all the contexts in which they're alive, they live their lives, and it creates a framework to attract resources. So these things it's a rationale for having a place-based approach to address these problems wherever they exist. And also the principles on which our zone is founded and runs are also critical to any other place-based approach in Belfast or beyond, where the problem is at its most fierce. And that is that it has to be child-centred, it has to be holistic, it needs to recognise that the solution to this is long-term, and it needs critically to create a seamless, supportive developmental pathway from early years to young adulthood. It's too easy to break these things up into management areas like dealing with underachievement or health or this or that or the other. It requires an absolutely seamless approach. And of course, in terms of partners, it requires an equality among partnership if that can be achieved. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jackie. That's an excellent presentation on terms of how educational deprivation can be addressed at that very local level. I think we've had 3 excellent presentations. We did run over a little bit, but I thought it was really important to ensure that all of the information was provided. And I'm not sure, Caroline will keep me informed if any questions come in, but I thought one of the things, and it relates to both something that Jackie said and also what Monica said earlier. Monica talked about a whole of a society approach in terms of the commercial determinants of health, and Jackie talked about a whole of community approach. And we know the challenges in partnership working and developing that framework from the very beginning. But I suppose it's a question both for Monica and Jackie. To what extent are the private sector playing a role in, or the corporate sectors playing a role in addressing deprivation or addressing inequalities at the local level, or even at that global level? So, Jackie, if you...
Okay, is this?
Yeah, you can just
I think it's a vital role, and I think it's refreshing that it's been highlighted here today as being something that is critical to the future. I fear in Belfast that we are a long, long way behind on the involvement of the private sector. Now, there are good reasons for that, in that we have a smaller private sector here than, we've a ginormous public sector and a smaller private sector. A second thing is that there are few of the private sector companies that are headquartered here. They tend to be headquartered in Europe and other parts of Europe, or in London or wherever. But an example of where this really works, I mean, in the United States it works because of the way things are structured there, and we need to learn from that. But it's also working in, for example, probably the most currently successful children's zone in the UK is the West London Children's Zone. And the West London Children's Zone, in terms of its resources, gets a very significant amount of its resources from developers, from private developers. Now, obviously that's to do with what's happening in London, but it's an example of what the future might look like. We've a long way to go. I believe there's a growing awareness in the private sector that if they are to see good outcomes for themselves, we cannot afford to leave behind these swathes of parts of Belfast in terms of educational and health deficits. It's in the self-interest of the private sector to be involved. And I think it's a journey that we need to go on, and that I think, Joan, we're in the foothills of at the moment.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And also, you did reference the Belfast Agenda earlier, and I'm actually a member of the Voluntary Community and Social Enterprise, but sit on the City Development Board. And as you said, it's out for refresh, but it's key to those big developers. It's how they can contribute to addressing those fundamental inequalities in the city. So maybe there is the opportunity there. We are, as you say, at the foothills. Monica, are you still with us, Monica?
I am indeed. Can you hear me okay?
All right, okay. Yes, we can hear you. Do you want to maybe add something to that discussion?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have to say, I fully agree with Jackie, and he's absolutely right that we are only just beginning to understand and to explore how we need to address some of this. And I think you asked specifically about the relationship with deprivation, and I think that we can see that from a number of different pathways, and perhaps the most also the one that's the most familiar to us is what we would call the access to common goods or services. Now, whether that's housing, whether that's water, whether that's affordable food, common green spaces, for example, that we've seen being sold off, but also the lack of access to this, particularly within deprived communities, where we know that there are, for example, it can be more difficult to access affordable food choices and so on. And conversely, we know that the private sector targets particular groups that at risk of vulnerability, such as the proliferation of alcohol outlets in certain communities, or fast food outlets, for example, but even more sort of prolific targeting through for example, particular racial groups, or even by gender, and through complex and sophisticated market schemes, and of course fundamentally children, which is the starting point there. So I think this is so I fully agree with Jackie that this is this is an area that needs to be looked at. And one of the advantages I think that you have at the local level, it's a little bit more challenging the more global we get, and the complexity around multinational organizations and so on, is that you have very your community or economic operators are there right in the community, so the accountability or the opportunity for accountability is very high, to engage them in to take a place-based approach, if you will, in order to address some of the commercial determinants. I think is a real unexplored area for how we can tackle this at a local level, but also still acknowledge that we need to be forward facing in terms of economic development and economic opportunity for the different groups that we're targeting. So this is I think there's a lot of work that we need to do, but we're starting to have the right conversations, which I think is a good launch point. And I'll stop there for this.
Yeah. Okay, Monica, yeah, some key points as well. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you wanted to comment on that, Erica, but one of the other areas was, as well as education, when we look at the deprivation data, what would be the key policy changes that we maybe should be considering across the city? A bit of a challenging question, but maybe particularly even in relation to the Belfast agenda as well, that we're now, refreshing.
I do think that education is key, but as Jackie said, within that larger context, I mean, unfortunately, we're in a situation where you measure things in a very linear way, and we've inherited a whole set of indicators that people keep, collecting year in, year out. So I think the educational arena is a very important one, because without a good quality education, I accept what Jackie's saying, that you can't just focus on education, but I think a good quality education is, given that we exist in a beverage-based system, a welfare state, it's having that access to a good quality of education, which can help empower, I think, children and young people to have more confidence, to be able to get a better job. But at the same time, you then need to be able to provide the jobs for people. I mean, sometimes there's a large mismatch going on, and what you have is people commuting into Belfast, for instance, to get the better jobs, whereas you still, as I like the words Jackie used about, you have this educational and health deficit. I think we also have to address, turning circles that are vicious into virtual circles. So if you just try to put together some of the data that we've put up, one of the reasons for economic activity is long-term sickness and disability, but then that has an economic impact that then affects people's health even more. So it's trying to bring together some of those core things, which I believe are being able to support families, communities to bring up children and young people, which will include education, but also those other leisure activities around that, meaning leisure in the broadest sense, and also being able then to invest in the city so that they have somewhere to go in terms of their employment, and you're not sucking in people from other areas to do, the most, if you like, life-enhancing jobs. You're going to get a better quality of work, you're going to get a better level of income, because all those things, if you look across the 7 domains, all those domains are important.
And that might link, Jackie, to, if children, if the, the success of the Shankill zone, are the opportunities there for those young people as they become adults?
Well, the opportunities won't necessarily be there in the Shankill, but they should be there in the city, and be able to access them in the city. But I mean, in terms of those policy areas that you asked about, Joan, I mean, the way to get better educational outcomes is to have a holistic approach to the lives of children and young people. That's all their lives. And if you want me to talk down into that about 2 policy areas that I think are critical, where something needs to be done urgently. One is about families and support for families. Absolutely critical, because that's where, in their early years and in their childhood years, that's the major influence on children, and yet we just assume that that happens okay by and large until something goes wrong or until it gets to be a social services issue. And the second area, if you ask me to fine it down even further, is early years. That's where we need the investment. And this isn't just about putting more money in here or there, the aspects of it. It's getting a seamless journey for children from before birth through their early years and beyond, but in critical, because we all know what all the evidence shows is that what happens to a child in their early years really does predict what's going to happen to them by and large in later years.
Absolutely key. And while you're speaking, Jackie, I was also thinking of some of the commercial determinants that you mentioned, Monica, in terms of, food and the I've lost the word, basically the role of the food industry in creating low quality food. Likewise, the role of, the issues around fuel poverty and increasingly now transport poverty, which is becoming an issue. So there's something about how all of that relates, Jackie, to the early years and the families. And I'm not sure, Monica, if you can comment on that, but there is something about the role of the food industry, the role of planning in terms of a lot of those fast food outlets that has been raised as, across some cities. Do you want to maybe just make a comment on that, or if there's any work that maybe elsewhere that is happening on that?
So just a short comment, perhaps. I think this is one of the critical points, and I think you mentioned two types of exposures there. One through the lack of access to these as a fundamental aspects of contributing to children's well-being, children's health, whether it's accessing healthy food choices, even in, for example, school settings and so on, in the procurement policies of what we provide within those settings, and this is of greater concern in some countries than others, but it's still the nutritional value of the content of food and food procurement processes, choices, and how that manifests in public settings such as schools and so on. But the other side of that is the obesogenic environment and the saturation of commercial outlets, which again we know that by and large these are in particular community settings, or these are clustered around particular communities. We also know that they're not necessarily affordable. So we also know that the price differences between some of these outlets versus sort of cheaper and healthier alternatives is not. We tend to think it's cheaper. Not always. That's not always the case. It's just it's captured. It's more accessible, and particularly when we start to think about transport policy and being able to access some things which are further away, and also time poverty, of course. And as Jackie mentioned, with regards to a holistic approach, this is another burden on families, particularly on the families and the commercial. So the commercial forces within that, particularly within the employment and how that impacts on what families can do and how they can access these things, particularly if it's not easy for them to do. And the place-based approach offers us a real opportunity to look at that, because as we all know, that talks about having things within a sort of 15 minutes city and being able to access what we need within that space. And I think you mentioned planning as an important tool to be able to provide families with what they need and at those critical junctions within that. There is quite some attention coming into this space, and from a WHO side, there is and recently there's been an acceleration plan for obesity, which was adopted at the World Health Assembly, which looks at these obesogenic environments, specifically looks at this from the perspective of malnutrition, so particularly within deprived communities. So this is a question of food poverty as much as it is a question of behavior, and then there is quite some attention at the global level around the food system itself, because of course we have a number of challenges, not only in terms of the carbon footprints and some of the bigger the climate impacts that we're all experiencing at the moment, but also in terms of security and food security. And so we've seen that the recent international developments, particularly in Ukraine, has had an impact on food prices. We're expecting more food price challenges in the period ahead. So these are all important global considerations which ultimately play out locally and impact on our most vulnerable communities that can afford it the least.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Monica. We're sort of just gone past our 4:30. Have you any final comments on any of that, Erica or Jackie?
Yeah, just to say that I think it's critical that government and ourselves realise that the situation here in relation to children and young people can't be resolved by any single department or any single approach. It requires a holistic approach, and to me that's the absolutely critical thing. The First Start report calls for interdepartmental working on all of this, and I mean, I think one of the weaknesses of so many of our approaches, and I include ourselves and myself in this, is that you break things down into management segments, and therefore you miss the absolute requirement for an integrated approach across so many different things.
Yeah. We're still at an early stage of that sort of whole of society, really, development of frameworks. Although we've huge experience in partnership working, it's that from the very early days, that whole of society framework and approach, and then delivering through that.
And if I could also, Joan, just say, because in terms of the commercial stuff that we were talking about there in that new field, we have to be aware of the cultural difference between how the private sector works and definitely how the government works, but also how us in the community and voluntary sector work, and overcoming those cultural, it's difficult for the private sector who operate at speed and from top-down decisions to do this, but we have to understand that if we're to develop that partnership.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay.
The only thing I'd like to say is, and Jackie referred to how they're working with families to understand what they want. And I think that's one of the things that I enjoy most about when I'm working in Belfast, is that the communities that, you know, Joan and Belfast Healthy Cities, Jackie and his colleagues work with, other partnerships that I've worked with in Belfast, is that connection with the communities and how you do listen to your communities. And therefore, in some senses, although the data I can put up, you know, from the various indicators might look bad, I think what you're working from is a group of people who are willing to listen to the communities that they're trying to work with and get interventions that are going to be much more appropriate to meet those community needs. And I think that is a strength of Belfast, to try and end on, you know, a positive note, because you can look at the data and think, oh no, it's all terrible, but actually, you know, there's a lot of strength there in Belfast. And I have to say, most of the communities I've worked with in this city have a very sophisticated understanding, not only of what the problems that they face are, but ways to solve those problems.
And I'm sure Monica will agree, often we've had the opportunity to showcase a lot of this work across the European Healthy Cities Network, but we've also had the opportunity to learn from it, and some of the interventions that have been introduced have been the result of engagement in that network. So I'm going to finish it there. So thank you very much, Monica. I know you have a busy schedule, and to Jackie as well, and Erica. And I think, you know, we could see the various levels here of this debate and this discussion, and we do need to continue it, particularly one, to engage those involved in commerce, but two, that we work at fundamentally addressing the inequalities using those platforms. So thank you very much. I think it's been an excellent discussion and excellent presentations.